Here's your lesson on parallel and perpendicular lines. We are going to start by graphing. So what we wanted you to end up doing is figuring out the relationship between these two lines and how you could discover what the relationship is just based on looking at the equations. So we want to get to a point to where we don't actually have to be graphing, but we'll start there. So we're going to start with the first one. Remember that when graphing, you really want it to be in y equals mx plus b, slope-intercept form, where m is your slope and b is your y-intercept. So slope is always in front of your x, always, always, always. So that means here, my slope is -3, and my y-intercept is 2. So on this particular one, I'm going to start off on the 2. That's my y-intercept. And then my slope is -3/1. So I'm going to go down 3/1. I want to make sure that since it's a negative slope that my line's going to end up heading downward, and it is. So let's keep going with down 3/1. You could also go backwards and go up 3 and the other way 1. That way you end up with a negative slope. My next line has a slope of -3, but this time the y-intercept is -1. So I'm going to start off at -1, which is my y-intercept, and I'm going to go down 3/1. So down 3/1. I can also go backwards and go up 3, left 1. And this one too has a negative slope. Now that I've graphed both my lines, I'm going to answer my 2 questions. So what's something that you notice about these 2 lines? I noticed that they are parallel to one another. And then these being parallel lines, what do you notice is similar about the 2 equations? Well, their y-intercepts were different. This y-intercept was 2. This y-intercept was -1. Here, though, on the slopes, even though they're in different positions, the slopes were the same. So now let's go to our next problem. We're going to graph both of these lines and check out this relationship. So again, we want to be in mx plus b. Luckily, my y is by itself. Here's the number in front of my x. So that makes this my slope, and that makes this my y-intercept. So I'm going to start at the y-intercept. So I'm going to start at 2. And then since my slope is 1/4, I'm going to go up 1/4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I just want to double check, make sure that my line is going to be headed upward, and it is. So as long as it's headed upward, because it's positive, I know I did it right. So I'm also going to go backwards, down 1, and the other way 4. And I have my first line. I'm now going to graph my second line. So again, double checking, making sure it's already in mx plus b. M is my slope, so -4. I'm going to put this over 1 so it's easier to travel. And my y-intercept is -3. So I'm going to start off at -3, and I'm going to go down 4, right 1. So from here, I'm going to go down 4, right 1. Since this is a negative slope, just make sure your line will head down, and it will. So I'm going to go backwards. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. What do you notice about these 2 lines? Well, they're definitely not parallel because they cross, and they seem to be crossing at a 90-degree angle. So we can go ahead and say that these look perpendicular. So what do we notice about the equations? Well, the y-intercepts were different. So were the slopes. But if you look carefully at the slopes, you'll notice that on the purple one, I went up 1/4. And on the brown one, I went up 4/1. So it looks like it's flipped the fraction. This actually has a particular vocabulary word in algebra. We call it the reciprocal. So this is going to be a very big word for us. But it's not just the reciprocal, because it didn't just flip around. It also was, one of them was positive and the other one was negative. So it also changed the signs. So we have opposite signs on those. So now you're going to draw your own conclusion about what you've observed in both of these scenarios. So maybe a sentence stem you could use is, if, since this is all about slopes, if slopes are blank, then the lines are blank. And then if the slopes are, and you can describe them in a different way, so that way you can identify what type of lines those are. So there's a couple of sentence stems for you. Hit pause if you still haven't finished writing your stuff out. And hopefully you're done with that, and we'll go to the back. So let's start with, what is the slope of a line that is parallel to this line? So what do we know about parallel lines? Well, if we look back on this side, we've noticed here that parallel lines, the slopes are the same. Hopefully that's something that you put in your sentence stem, that the slopes are the same. So I'm just going to make a little note here that says same. So now I need to look at this line. I don't want to graph it. I just want to look at the equation and say, what is my slope? Well, remember, slope is always in front of x. And since I don't have an x, what would that make the slope? 0. Well, if it's parallel, then the slope is the same. This one wants you to write the equation for a line that is parallel. So once again, I'm going to make my note. The word parallel means what about the slopes? Same. What is the slope of our line? Let's look at this equation. Now the 5 won't be our slope because it's not in front of the x. So in front of the x is our m, which is our slope. So our slope is -2/3. But it's got to go through this point specifically. So on your linear equations from your formula chart, that section, there is a particular type of equation that you can write when you have a point, but you also know the slope of the line. And that is called point slope. So usually, sometimes you can write them with boxes, make it a little bit easier for you. That would be straight off the formula chart, with this being y, this being slope, and this being x. X goes with x, y goes with y, slope goes in the middle. And I'm going to keep the same slope because it's parallel. Let's rewrite this. Y minus 0. I don't need to write -0. Sometimes I would write y minus and then my number, but because it's 0, I'm just going to put y. If it was a 2, I'd put y minus 2, but it's 0, so I'm just going to leave it y. I have -2/3. I'm not going to distribute yet. And double negatives makes a positive. I can actually leave this like this just for this practice. Normally at this point, I would distribute and get this in mx plus b, but we'll go ahead and leave it like that for now. And let's go to our next one. Perpendicular. So what does the word perpendicular mean about our slope? Well, if you would go back to number 2, when we had perpendicular lines, it looked like the slopes, the fraction flipped, so we got the reciprocal, and the signs became opposite. So what we want to know first is what is our actual slope, and then what would it be if we flipped it and changed the sign. So I've noticed here that my y is not by itself. So I can't do anything just yet. I need to get my y by itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write down this original equation just real small over here so that way I can solve. Since that 3 is attached to the y, I'm going to have to divide in order to get it off of the y. 6 divided by 3 is 2. And then I'm just going to leave this as a fraction because otherwise I get a crazy decimal. Now that y is by itself, you can tell what the slope is. Remember, it's m. It's always in front of your x. But perpendicular doesn't mean same. Perpendicular means that we're going to flip this. So it's going to be 3 over 2. And we're going to change the sign. So it's going to go from negative to positive. Now I can write my point slope. So I've got my perpendicular slope here, 3 over 2. Slope goes in the middle. I've got a point to work with. X goes with x, y goes with y. And now I can write my equation. I have y minus 4. Have my perpendicular slope here, and I just have x minus 1. And for the purposes of this practice, I'll leave this like this for now. So our next one also says perpendicular. Looks a little easier though because my y is by itself. So what would be the perpendicular slope for this equation? Well, let's look at our slope. Our slope is 4 because our slope is always in front of x. If I make it a fraction, it'll be a lot easier to follow this reciprocal rule. So perpendicular means I do the reciprocal, so it's going to be 1 over 4. And I also do the opposite sign. So it's positive, it's going to become negative. So this right here is going to be my perpendicular slope. And this one doesn't want an equation of the line. This one just wants the slope. So I've got it, negative 1 over 4. All right, so now you are going to do this section. And your submission for these notes is going to be your answers for all of these questions here. So you'll do that, and then you'll be able to check yourself before you go into your Stonehenge practice.